Welcome back to the Grief Mentor Show. I am your host, Teresa Davis. One of the goals of the Grief Mentor podcast is to bring tools for the journey to the brokenhearted. Today we are going to discuss EMDR therapy. We are going to discuss grief, sexual abuse, suicide, and ways that EMDR is utilized to bring us to a place where we can begin to live again. Today, my guest is Paul Crecelius. He is a licensed counselor and a retired Army chaplain. He retired after 40 years of service. He has utilized EMDR in his practice since 1997 to help soldiers work through war trauma. He is passionate about helping people work through the trauma that holds them captive. So let's get to it. Welcome to the Grief Mentor podcast with Teresa Davis. It exists to restore hope, promote healing, and equip grieving souls for life after loss. I will illuminate God's Word through the eyes of grief and provide interviews that speak healing into the mind, body, and spirit of the brokenhearted. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I want to mention that Paul has never been my counselor. I've never seen him for treatment, and I reached out to him and he graciously accepted my invitation to come and chat with me. So thank you for joining me, sir. And let's get started. Let's tell the folks how you became familiar with the use of EMDR and how do you use it in your practice?
I've been practicing as a counselor since 1989, and I was looking for ways to help people that are working through trauma because I found that talk therapy, while beneficial, just didn't seem to meet or fit the bill for a lot of people. And it seemed to be taking a lot longer than really what I thought was necessary. And then EMDR came along and I discovered I could go to this training, and I went to start to work through and understand how this thing works. And I didn't hesitate one bit to begin it. A lot of my colleagues seemed a little afraid of it, and they told me I was crazy because I would jump right in and start using it. And I found it to be just darn incredible as to what the process would do to help people get through trauma a lot faster than normal and to go back to living a pretty good, healthy life.
I read that EMDR was founded by Frances Shapiro. She's a psychologist in 1990, and you've been using it since 1997. So basically, in its infancy, you are one of the probably first counselors that started using it. Now, you were still in the military at that point.
I was in the National Guard at the time. I was part-time military, part-time civilian. Yes.
Tell the listeners what EMDR stands for.
Stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing.
And how is that effective in helping someone process trauma?
Let me talk a little bit about how the brain operates with this, because this is pretty significant. When a person's moving their eyes, it's actually connecting with both sides of the brain, left or right side. When a person has a trauma, they typically get stuck in the emotional side of the brain, and they have an emotional attachment to that trauma. And then the left side of the brain, and this is too simplistic, but it's as simple as I can make it. The left side of the brain is seeing it logically and understand, no, okay, really, I couldn't have had anything to do with it, but they're not convinced. So I call that being stuck. And so what happens is when they start processing, it stimulates the brain, or what's better known as bilateral stimulation, where the brain begins to process the memory, looking at the evidence, looking at the reality, and then the right and the left side of the brain begin to work through it. And when it's seen and seen clearly, there is actually a coming together where the emotions and the evidence work together to bring relief and release from that particular event. How it works in the brain, I couldn't begin to tell you neurologically. I'm not that smart, but I just know, and I'm seeing a lot of people make a lot of shifts in the mind when they begin to use the EMDR. And I liken this to what Paul the Apostle talks about in Romans 12, the renewal of the mind. And what he also talks about, the transformation, becoming a new creation. It's like God begins to work and helps us see the truth that begins to set us free. That's the way I look at it.
So let me make sure I understand. Basically, the left brain and the right brain have two different opinions about this trauma.
One's emotional and the other one's logical.
Okay, so I know I'm making this super simple, but that's how I need to understand it. So one is emotional and one is, you said, logical. When you have this trauma, it's in two separate places, and EMDR makes them meet. Is that correct?
Yeah, brings them together to be able to make the emotions and the logic make sense and basically come to what's better known as a reasonable conclusion based on evidence. So it's like someone who's been sexually assaulted. They know that they didn't do anything wrong, but the right brain is so emotionally charged, they can't hardly believe they didn't do something. And so they begin to go back and begin to process this memory, and the information that the brain has stored about what happened is the logical evidence that comes together with the emotions to say, wait a minute, there was no way I could have had anything to do with this because of these particular events that took place before it happened, after it happened. It's like I'm looking at myself saying, wait a minute, there's no way in the world I could have done anything. I'm innocent in this. I'm not guilty. And so as a result of that, they can let go of the trauma. And then we begin to reprocess what they learned from that, what it teach them. That made sense.
Well, it did make sense. So basically, you got one part of your brain over here analyzing it in its way, and then you've got the other part of the brain over here analyzing it in its way, and then they don't connect, so they're disassociated.
That's right.
Okay.
It's like they're disconnected from each other.
How would that work with somebody that's grieving, such as I shared a little bit of my story with you before we started. In my particular case, how would that help me be able to deal with that trauma?
There's a lot of people that will put a verbiage into their grief that seems to incriminate themselves, to say in some way, should have seen it, should have known, should have done, should have been able to get over to the plane, could have been anything that I could tell myself that sounds reasonable, but it's not. So there is, for instance, no way in the world we can know when someone's going to die. We can have some idea if we can anticipating someone with a disease or something. But when something like that happens and then we associate ourselves with that trauma, with that grief, with that loss in a negative way, then basically what we've done is created a trauma. And so when you start processing with EMDR, then the bilateral stimulation of the brain can help the person come to the conclusion that there really was nothing they could do, and now they can begin to grieve. Or they have all the memories and everything they saw, like you mentioned, the fire engines and the police and the tape and all this type of stuff, and not being able to get there, and that runs through the mind. That's why we call it desensitization. We can lessen the impact of those memories on the person who's grieving, because those things can become intrusive in the ability to grieve, to be able to move through it.
In my personal situation, I would run that scenario of what happened that day, because I was out going to the crash site, and I would run that through my head over and over and over again, and I couldn't control it. I simply could not. I couldn't control it. When you do EMDR, I know there's some different ways to do it. Do you use the objects in your hands, or do you use the lights?
I use a light bar and ear set for tones in the ear to go left to right, and in sync with the lights.
In sync with the lights. I would want to touch on this because I know that you use EMDR in your practice a little differently than other counselors. You've already mentioned that. You look at it through the lens of Paul when you say you're renewing your mind. So how do you incorporate God's word into your practice and using EMDR?
Well, it's basically waiting for the Holy Spirit to give you the word that you need to have in order to help somebody along the way. So I'll do my best to give you something here, to where a person who is carrying a certain amount of guilt over something that happened to somebody else, and what I'll actually have them do, because God is evidential, and I'll tell them that God doesn't let us just run. Faith isn't something that just goes on blind faith. It's something that God gives us evidence for. Faith itself is evidence. So we're going to begin to look for evidence that says to the contrary of what you actually believe about that memory. So what I do with people, if they're saying they're guilty, then I'll actually have them begin to look for evidence to prove it. Start looking for evidence that says you're actually guilty. And so when I ask that question, the brain is now geared up to begin to look. Basically, it's the right brain looking. The left brain has an understanding that that's just not possible. And so what happens then is that they begin to look for that evidence. They actually can't find any because there isn't any. So it's like when the enemy tells us that we're worthless and we're of no value, the kingdom of God says we are. So here's evidence, and the evidence to me is the cross. And so I'll let people know that this is the thing that stays in place that tells me I have worth and value. So now I believe that. But other people go through these particular scenarios. They are thinking evidentially that they are guilty in some way, shape, or form. So they're believing this lie, but the brain has the information to show them to the contrary. And somehow or another, the brain does it to where the person sees it. And when they actually see the evidence, they can't declare themselves guilty anymore. They say they're innocent. There's a release that comes with that. And then they begin to let go and start to feel more peace and feel a lot more relaxed along the way.
I've met so many parents in my journey, Paul, that have lost children that walk around with a tremendous amount of guilt, but they're not guilty. So what you just said right there, I just really hope if someone's listening and they're walking in that path that they just heard what you said, because there's no evidence. There's no evidence, but yet we want to accuse ourselves and make ourselves responsible then, because if we could have done something to have stopped it.
There's a determination on all of our parts to make sense of a circumstance that doesn't make any sense. And so it's not uncommon for us to begin to apply ourselves to these circumstances as though we had something to do with it, and we didn't. And when people begin to see that truth, because I've had some family members who've lost children who've processed these things and thinking they should have been keeping a better eye on the child or anything like this, that they did something that when they go back, they recognize the reality is that there was truly nothing they could do. It was definitely out of their control. And as a result of that, they could allow themselves to let that go. And then their grief will start to take up and move toward a conclusion, you might say. Whereas if they didn't, they stay stuck where they are, and then they just cycle through that, just keep looping around in that self-accusation.
As a parent of a child who still lives in your home, you're responsible.
Mm-hmm.
So
that you are.
So I can understand why, if a parent has a child in a home and they walk in and find them gone, that the responsibility they feel like falls on them.
Oh, they do. Easily it does. And they can start to look at for things that think that like they have an omniscience in some way to be able to have stopped whatever took place. Maybe they could have, but sometimes kids get out of sight. Sometimes children are a little faster than we are. Sometimes we step aside for a minute thinking, well, okay, it'll be okay. We'll just step aside for a second and then come back and find in that situation. And then we'll basically start tearing into ourselves for taking that minute. And it's instead of seeing life as, and this is where people begin to not just accuse themselves, but even accuse God. Like, why did you let that happen? Why didn't you tap my shoulder, or why didn't you do something to tell me this was going on? And then we start to say these things to God as though he should have done some type of intervention. Now we stay resentful, and we have to resolve all those things in order to be able to move on in a healthy grief.
How do you do that? How do you help your patients move through? Well, let's back up a little bit, because we're talking exactly what my next question is. What happens to the brain during the grieving process? We're kind of discussing that already. When somebody's going down that path is very familiar to me. I definitely walk that path, and I know several other people that have walked that path as well. Is EMDR helpful in that situation?
Yeah, it actually is, because it's most people, while we're going through grief, there is a lower level of different neurochemistries that be able to process this, which makes a lot of sense. There's lack of dopamine because we don't feel so good. There is our ability to think it through isn't exactly the best, and so depression will ensue. But when there's self-blaming in those moments, there's even less ability to process through it, more depression, and basically being disabled. So when you start doing the EMDR, hopefully what it will do is stimulate the brain to begin to look at every aspect of what we're grieving, so that we can, in so many words, collect ourselves to be able to process through that grief. So what happens in the brain is we can allow ourselves to go through. Let me step back. People that go through a healthy process of grief, their brain is processing well. They are doing everything, is going through the stages, moving to the point of acceptance. People who have trauma when it comes to grief are not grieving so well because they're stuck somewhere. So the brain now has to be stimulated in a way, and this is what EMDR does, is stimulate it so that they can begin to move again in that grief. They can resolve where they're stuck and be able to move ahead. And some of that is, why did God not do something about it? So I actually have people process through looking to find evidence or find a way that God would have intervened. How would he have done it if he was going to intervene? What do you think he would have done? And most people have the word intervention in mind because they're not really thinking about life as far as there is death and there is sorrow. There are losses. And so we want God to intervene in these things. And sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't, but we still have no idea how he would actually do it. And so typically when people start to process through looking as to how God would actually intervene, they really can't find anything. They really can't come up with anything. And then they can begin to start to process that grief normally, naturally.
One thing that can complicate grief is sudden death.
Mm-hmm.
How is EMDR therapy useful in someone who, well, like in my case, Andrew was here on Thursday, gone on Friday. And then it was 3 days before they confirmed that he was on the plane. So how is EMDR helpful in that situation?
Well, it can help people move from a place of shock and denial into moving into the reality that they're gone. So it's somebody dies in our lives. Like my father passed away when I was 15. He died of a heart attack, and it was just sudden out of nowhere. So it's like, is he gone? And we had to, he's passed away. He's gone. He's not coming back. But I'm still spinning over this, trying to figure out what happened. And I'm still trying to understand what a heart attack is, because I'm 15 and I'm not real, savvy about any of this stuff. And I had to come to the place of understanding that he was gone. He wasn't coming back. And sadly, I didn't actually grieve my father's death for another 20 years. So I kept that until I was 30, 35. And I had to go counseling because it was making me so depressed that I didn't even know that was what was making me so depressed to be able to move ahead. So what happens with sudden death and how EMDR helps is begin to move us out of this thinking that they're coming back or they're not really dead because we haven't seen them or so on. It helps the brain to process the evidence or the reality of what's taken place, and then come to the reality that the terrible reality that someone has passed away and they are coming back. That's one aspect of it.
I feel like just listening to you describe the right and the left brain and been through the grief process, well, you'd have as well. So it's so confusing, Paul, and you understand that because of what you've been through. It's so confusing to try to process all the things that are happening to you at once. And you've already mentioned the chemicals in your brain, the dopamine, the serotonins, all the things that are fluctuating so severely. Can you help us understand? So many of us in our culture, especially, I don't think we embrace suffering well. We have this unrealistic expectation that get over the grief and move on. And I think that complicates our ability to be able to process grief because we feel like we shouldn't feel this way. So speak
Yeah.
to, in your experience, what kind of time frames we're looking at here when somebody starts therapy with you, especially in a grief situation or a sudden death situation. What kind of time frame and what kind of expectations should they have on themselves during the grieving process?
Well, you're right. Some people in our society they want things to be over with quickly. We have this idea that suffering shouldn't be, and those are the things that make it difficult for us to process. It's as a believer, I had come to the reality that this is the world that I live in, and there is suffering, there is death, there is dying, there are people who will be abused. It is a terrible place as far as a lot of that happening. And if I don't accept that reality, then when it comes to that thing coming into my life, I'll have a hard time grieving. So when you begin to process through this with EMDR, it, you come to this reality that there's nothing we could do to stop the suffering in its totality. There's nothing we can do to stop death and dying. Obviously, Christ is the one that's had to do this. And so when you process, it's basically bringing someone to that reality. And then when they get there, the brain chemistry is now beginning to come up to where there's enough serotonin to be able to process this and think it through, norepinephrine to process it and think it through. And there's actually a relief that comes because we're accepting that reality in life. When people live in a world where they believe that that should never happen, then they have set themselves up neurochemically to not be able to process life on its own the way we see it. So what I do with EMDR is help people come to that reality that this is just part of living. And as a believer, yes, we grieve, but we don't grieve as the world grieves. It doesn't mean we don't grieve. It just means we have hope, because Paul says we grieve as people who have hope. And that's what I want to get people to when they're processing through this. It's not to take away that grief, because it won't, as is to help them process through it better, to bring it to a conclusion, and not, it's never totally concluded, but enough to be able to function better in life, to be able to go on and work, and to be able to maybe even to love again, and to connect with other people again, and to trust again, and not be afraid of life.
You mentioned earlier that EMDR, you noticed in your practice, moved people along quicker than talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about that a little bit.
When I was going through the training, they talked about how quickly EMDR works. And in my experience, I've had people who've come to me. It's not like I'm not making myself sound like I'm the ultimate therapist in the world, but I've had people who've come to me who have gone through the talk therapy process to find it just wasn't getting there. I mean, it helped some, but it wasn't moving them to where they needed to be. So when we were doing the training, they talked about how quickly it processed, and they said we could say that 1 hour of EMDR is equivalent to 1 year of talk therapy when it comes to processing and studying the brain and how fast it moves, how quickly it processes things, unless we're impairing it somehow or another. It is no surprise that when people begin to see the truth about a particular event or the things that have happened in their lives or the grief that they're going through, that they are processing faster than if they were to talk about it. And I've seen that since 1997, watching a lot of people do it. And then I have people who don't. They stall out because there's something maybe they get out of the memory. They hang on to it. Maybe they get a lot of sympathy and a lot of attention from it, so they'll keep it. They don't want to process through it, so they stall out. But there are the people that do process through it. Let me just say, when they're finished processing, typically they're finished processing.
I know everybody, I'm sure, is individualized, but what kind of time frame have you seen that happen in?
Well, we look at it, if a person's processing well, I've seen people process up to 5 to 10 sessions.
How long does each EMDR session last?
Well, it's not always an hour, but most times it's about an hour.
And does that involve talk therapy while you're going through?
It's more of observing, because EMDR is more of an observation process, where a person is sitting where they are at their age, looking back at a circumstance when they were younger, And it's like sitting on the train. We use the metaphor of the train, and the train's going by and the events are going by as the train moves. And they're watching these events take place, and the brain is processing all these events. The brain is remarkable in the way that it can process what it needs to process. It will go where it needs to go. And it's like, there's no control in it. And so when people are processing, I just let them sit there and think about it, observe, then we'll stop doing the eye movement. We'll talk a little. And then it's like, what are you getting? Okay. And they'll tell me, and that's okay. Now observe that. And then they're processing more, stop, and they'll talk a little. All right, now observe that. And eventually, and we're measuring this thing on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 where it doesn't bother you, 10 where it's the worst. And if they started out, say, as a 9, and then they're processing along, we're testing it to see if this thing is coming down. And that means they're desensitizing, and that means they're getting through it and bringing it to a close as far as stuckness is concerned.
So these observations that they're observing, they would not otherwise be able to observe that if they weren't involved in this therapy.
Yeah, more time than not, because I have people that say, I remember this, I remember that. And then when they start processing, they're like, oh, I forgot about that. Oh, yeah, that's right. So-and-so said so-and-so, or so-and-so did thus and such. And they start putting other pieces into the puzzle that changes the whole dynamics of the memory. And when they do that, well, as a personal example, again, of myself is like when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was sexually abused. And when I looked at myself before that happened, I wasn't thinking anything about any such a thing, because I did accuse myself. I must have done something to cause that. And when I went back and looked at it, it was like, but I didn't even have that in mind. I was just 8 or 9 years old, and I didn't know anything about it. And then this happens, and then now all of a sudden I'm the one that's at fault. There's no way. And I saw myself as innocent. And I got a lot of people like that who accuse themselves. A soldier who was in a 5 convoy gun truck in Iraq, and the second gun truck got hit by an IED. He was in the 5th truck, and he believed he should have been able to see it, warn the truck, and the truck was flipped over, and the gunner was pinned from waist down. He believed he should have been able to save that gunner sitting in the last truck. Now, you and I'd look at that and be like, what? How? And then as he processed, in about 20 minutes, he said, he just sat back, took a deep breath. He looked at it and he says, there was nothing I could do. And he let it go. He had been drinking. His family was starting to basically dissipate. His career was in jeopardy. And after he did that, he got into recovery, quit drinking, got his family reconciled, and got his career back on track.
That's amazing. So
yeah.
So while you were talking, this is what was going on in my head. So I see the left brain and the right brain running alongside each other, but they're not in sync.
Yeah.
And then when you process somebody in the terms that you're using, it brings clarity and joins those runners so that they're now running on the same path.
That is a great analogy. I like that. Yes, exactly.
It's just amazing to me how powerful our brain is, and to have the tools to be able to bring something. I mean, that's an amazing story about that young man. To be able to help him bring the clarity of, I really could not have done anything to have stopped this. My heart is heavy for so many people that I have come in contact with whose children have died by suicide. The amount of guilt that goes in tandem with situations like that is unbelievable. Have you had the opportunity to work with people in that situation? And can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, I've had, unfortunately, too many. One of the things they wonder about their eternal security, things like this that they will talk about. But the other thing that they will talk about the most is believing that they should have seen something, should have known something, and then ultimately should have done something. And so what we do is when we start processing this, it's like the same thing. All right, so look for the evidence that says you knew this was coming. And so in processing, I haven't had anybody yet say, well, yeah, I knew it was coming and I knew what the plan was and everything else. They may say, well, I had a hint. Okay, you question about it. You question them and see, if that's what would have happened. I mean, did you do that at the time? They thought, no, I just really didn't. It was something that popped up in my head, but it wasn't anything that was standing out. And as they process, they see more and more that there was really nothing they could do. There was nothing they really did see. There really weren't that many red flags. And statistically, there's about 20% of the people who will do this will do it out of complete silence. And then there's the other percentage that do it, and they will give you some indication and give you strong indication. They will say in many effects that they don't want to live anymore and so on. Yeah, you'll get those things, and you can still try and you can still do what you can, but some of them will still commit suicide and there was nothing you could do about it. And this is part of the process that as they go through it, they can relinquish that responsibility because they carry this. And I've got even some folks right now who've gone through this with their children committing suicide. And it's like they're still processing through this and trying to figure out what their responsibility is. And as we process, they find out they really had none. They were parents, yes, but they could not, nor did they know that this child was going to go do anything. And even some people with their adult, their parents wanting to commit suicide and committing suicide, there was nothing they could do, or a husband or a wife. But inevitably, everybody I see will blame themselves somehow. And as we process through, more times than not, they'll find there really is nothing there. And until they really see it, they don't allow themselves to grieve because they're too busy blaming themselves.
And that's the stuck part you were mentioning earlier. We get a certain place in our journeys where we cannot move past it. And I understand that. And maybe you did too. I mean, you said it was 20 years before you were able to process your father's death because for whatever reasons, I planned on ending the podcast with this statement. But one of the things that I frequently share with my followers is if you don't manage your grief, it will manage you.
Mm-hmm. That's a fact.
Go ahead.
So let me say, because there's a little bit more to the story about my father than just dying of a heart attack, because he was the sole breadwinner of our home. I'm the youngest of 7. And so I would hear often that he was stressed about making money. So I was interpreting that as I was a burden. And so I was causing this trouble. So the day he died, I'd asked, what happened? They said, well, he died of a heart attack. Well, how could that be? Well, he was just nervous all the time. He was anxious all the time. About what? About taking care of the family. So I indicted myself in believing that somehow I killed him. And so it took me 20 years to start moving again. I became a pretty good drunk as a result of that. Starting at 16 and I was bearing that for a long time. And then 20 years later, it's almost like I'd forgotten it, but I was still carrying this. And it started to come out that I was carrying that burden, and then discovered I was innocent.
Did you enter therapy at that point?
I did. Yeah, but it wasn't EMDR. It was talk therapy, and it took a long time to get through that, to come to that reality.
As I shared with you at the beginning of the podcast before we started recording, that I had gone to talk therapy, and it was good, but eventually I just felt like I was just running in place. That's the way I guess I could describe it. I just felt like I was just running in place and I wasn't getting anywhere, even though I was reading everything I could get my hands on, but yet I was just so stuck that I couldn't move past that. Unresolved grief can lead to substance abuse, addiction, or worse. But, people have such a struggle of making the decision to take the step to move forward. What can you say to people that are on the fence?
Well, if people are thinking that they're okay where they are, and yet they can see their life is struggling emotionally, there's just not a lot of peace. There isn't a lot of joy in life or happiness in life, or it's like you really can't enjoy a lot of things because there's something nagging at you. then it needs to be paid attention to. Something, even if you don't know what it is, go explore it, because it could be something that is pretty simple to take care of. It could be something that could be complicated, but it's still something that if you don't take care of it, you just won't be able to live the life to the full. And Jesus talked about coming and giving life to the full. What I've seen is the enemy stealing. And when he steals, everybody thinks he comes to steal your joy, but I think he comes to steal your mind. If he can steal your mind, he'll steal everything else. Get you to believe lies, get you to take responsibility. And so there's people on the fence like this because they're not really sure. Plus, they carry the stigma of thinking about going to counseling. What are people going to say? They're going to think I'm weak or something. Like, no, that's really a great strength. I look at Jesus, and he had 12 men gathered around him, and he would ask them to pray for him. And it's like he's the Son of God, and he's still asking people to pray for him and to watch for him. And like, if he needs that, how much more do I need it? And how much more do other people need it? It's like, it's not weakness, because we seek the counsel of other people because we don't know everything. We can't carry everything. And I'm watching a lot of folks try that. And I encourage them, you can get through this thing and you can lead a better life because Christ came to give it to the full. And so in the processing that I do, I actually have people picture, what would your life be like if and when you get past this memory or this trauma, or you begin to work through this grief. Picture it for a minute, the abundant life that Christ came to give. And we actually process that. And some people have a hard time seeing it. Other people see it as, wow, there'd be a lot of peace. It would be a lot of relief, a lot of joy that would come into the heart and soul. It would be a lot of something that is far better than what I'm going through now. And they're encouraged. And then we start processing more to get through it. It's like they needed this comfort and this word of encouragement to begin the process. And I think and apply that based on what Paul the Apostle said in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where he talks about God of all comfort. And he says, we were in stress and distress of our very lives, but we trusted the one who would raise the dead. And so we know the one that would do that. And from those words, I let people know that no matter what you go through, no matter what the distress is, there is relief and there is comfort that can come. And I encourage you, go do something, go help yourself. And there's nothing wrong with it. And people may think you're weak, but you're not. It takes great strength to go do it.
Do people express to you that abundant life seems unreachable?
Yeah, they do. It's just not possible because of the burdens they're carrying. And and a lot of the burdens they're carrying are lies that they've been believing about themselves. And then when they process through the evidence, they begin to see that for too long they've been carrying that, or way too long.
I love how you say process the evidence.
God is evidential.
I've spent a lot of time in the Word, and I love chapter 16 in the book of John when Jesus is preparing his disciples for his departure.
Yes.
It's something that I cling to, because he says, in a little while, you won't see me again, but in a little while, you'll see me again.
Yeah.
When you spoke earlier of the hope that we have as Christians, and I know that there's going to be people that listen to this podcast that don't call themselves Christians. I want them to understand that EMDR therapy is not based on Christianity, but it can be utilized in any way to help someone process through their situations. But for me as a believer, that is what gets me out of the bed every day, knowing that Andrew's spirit is still alive. His physical body is gone. However, I can relate to people that says, I need something now. You said that a minute ago. You said he doesn't leave us without evidence, everything being all spiritual, what's to come, what's to come. We focus a lot as Christians on what's to come, but what about right now? What do we need right now for the journey to make it in our everyday life? And so what I've kind of heard throughout our conversation is that we as human beings have expectations that lead us into believing stuff that's not true, and it sets us up for failure. A lot of our expectations set us up for failure. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, it does, because a lot of those expectations are unrealistic. We're not really thinking through what they look like and are they achievable. And for me, it's It's like living life as simple as I can without a whole bunch of expectations and understanding that they're just not always possible to fulfill. But my expectations are in Christ, and everything He told me will come. And what do I need right now? Well, what I need is the hope that He gives. And that's what I hang on to. And I begin to look around and begin to see the image of God in every man, begin to see that Christ died for every man. That makes it more tangible for me. Begin to see that there is hope, even in the midst of all this world, because there is good news to help people work through the traumas in life, or to basically gain eternity, to gain relationship with the Father, to reconcile themselves to God. And there's a lot of stuff in the way too. There's a lot of trauma, a lot of self-accusations, a lot of pain and sorrow, a lot of accusing God even, that will keep people from becoming clearer in their relationship and their ability to reconcile with the Father.
Fact versus fiction. So you mentioned earlier about taking thoughts captive. And to me, what that means is exactly what you've said. You figure out what the truth is. Because if we can't figure out what the truth is, then we can't come to a decision that we need to make to be able to move forward if we can't process the truth. In my personal journey, I blamed God. I felt betrayed. It was like this huge mountain that I could not get over because I could not figure out how He could let this happen. Even being a Christian for as many years as I have been, that was a real hurdle for me. And it was a process, but I went to His Word.
Mm-hmm.
And I took those thoughts captive. But in the beginning, you can't do that, Paul. It's like the overwhelm. And I think you completely understand this, is that the overwhelm of the grief in your mind is it's so difficult. That's why I think it's so important to get help, because there's so much going on in your mind. You can't process it. You can't even take care of yourself, your physical needs. I couldn't, because it's so overwhelming, and your brain, it's like your brain has been assaulted, and it's trying to recover. I mean, would you agree with that?
I would, because it's, as much as we may be desensitized about death in this society, when death comes to our doorstep, it becomes an incredible reality that we'll have one of two reactions to. We will find ourselves grieving and feeling the pain of that loss, or we'll be in denial and act like it's no big deal and feel nothing, and then be stuck for years. It's just, and it's a sad place to be. And yes, we do need help, and there is a lot of help for people who are going through grief if you will just reach out and get it. Grief groups, art therapy, even play therapy. There's behavioral therapy. There's cognitive behavioral therapy. There's all sorts of different places you can go to help you work out some of these things. But one of the things that I found with EMDR is it will help you get some clarity and be able to move forward in your grief, because it can help you process through where you're stuck. And then you can get unstuck and start living in the reality, because there's a lot of folks who grieve, who should be going through grief, but they're not living in the reality about that grief and about the loss. And that's where they stay stuck. But yes, there's so much pain.
Are there other treatment modalities that you use, for instance, with someone that's grieving, or is EMDR your main course of treatment?
Well, we'll do some talk therapy too. I'm not like, so staunch that I just do all EMDR. We'll sit and we'll talk through some things, like talk through what the losses are, talk through the pain of that. I mean, there's so many aspects to it. And then I'll listen carefully for things that can be processed, because it's not all noticeable in the front end. But as you get to know people and talk to them about what they've been through, then you see some things that actually could help them, that EMDR could help them with.
For me personally, I could not find someone to accept me as a patient. And it was a desperate time in my life. I felt like I was kind of losing control, because the counselor that I was going to, he only did talk therapy. He really didn't have any connections to connect me with anybody that did EMDR. So I started looking online. I went to, Psychology Today and put in some filters. And that's how I found the therapist that I eventually spent quite a bit of time with. But I had to wait 3 weeks. And the problem was most counselors would not make an appointment for me 3 weeks in advance. I left a message, and God love her, she heard the desperation in my voice and called me back. But that's a frustrating thing. EMDR therapy is a popular therapy, and it's difficult to find providers. It's been my experience that it's difficult to find providers that will use that type of therapy. What advice would you give to someone who, because it's really kind of overwhelming, Paul. I was trying to process grief. I was trying to find a counselor. I knew that I needed additional help, but I didn't know anything about EMDR. I just thought, well, maybe this will help. So what advice would you give someone who is wanting to reach out to find a counselor? How do they choose a counselor?
Well, you can go on the EMDR website and you can find a therapist. Look for one in your area and region. The other thing is the word of mouth. I don't know, if you know other counselors who know EMDR therapists but they can certainly refer you. You have to just do internet searches for different counseling centers and just see who's on there and does EMDR. There's quite a few EMDR therapists, but not enough to go around, I guess. And the other thing is, right now, since COVID and everything, it's even more difficult to get an appointment because I'm as busy as I can be, and all my colleagues who do EMDR are as busy as they can be. And it's just very difficult to get in. But what I do have, because I have an assistant who takes care of my appointments, I have a cancellation list. And so people can get on my cancellation list, and believe me, I have cancellations. I would suggest that they do the same thing. Find an EMDR therapist and talk to them about when there's cancellations to be able to get in sooner than what you normally would, and see what they'll do. I sometimes have people will call in desperation, and I'll find a time somewhere to get them in if I can.
What is the name of the EMDR website?
It's just EMDR.com.
EMDR.com. And then they can go there and plug in a zip code and it'll pull up therapists in that area.
There's a drop-down menu, and one of them says find a therapist.
Well, that's great information because I didn't even know there was such a thing.
Yeah, pretty sure it's still there.
Well, that's good for those that are listening if they're interested in that therapy. But another thing too, I've noticed too, Paul, there's MDR and there's EMDR. Everybody has their style or the way that they implement EMDR. The way that you're utilizing it is new to me. I was not taken through the process like you talked about here with us today. I wish I would have been. I'll include in the show notes how to contact Paul. But as he said, he does have a waiting list just so that everybody is aware of that. What have we not touched about on EMDR, Paul, that you would feel like it's important for our listeners to hear?
Well, I think that people need to know that it's not magic. It depends on really the willingness of the person who is processing as to how well it goes. I'm not sure what else I could even say. It's something that I know works when it does work, and I don't promise to everybody that it works, anybody actually. And I let people know that this is the Holy Spirit's job, and he will show you what you need because your brain has stored it, and he'll touch that part of the brain to bring it out to show you exactly what it is that you need to know in order to get through this and in order to be able to move through your grief or whatever it is that you're coming for. And so that people know that you can go with an expectation, but you can look at the therapist with an expectation too, and understand they can only do what you do and they can only work with what you have. There are some EMDR therapists, and some people may think that I'm somewhat rogue myself, and there are people that can do some harm. And so you need to be sure you know who has been through the training and who hasn't. And I would tell you that for sure. I've developed some of my own protocols. I still follow the protocols that I was trained in. And there are some things that I've developed that actually have helped people work through things a little bit more efficiently, I think. And that's my opinion. But just know that when you start and you go do EMDR, you have to be willing to put in the time and the energy in it.
I can't thank you enough for coming and sharing all of your expertise. I've enjoyed it so much. I feel like I should be paying you or something. You did such a great job of explaining EMDR and in a way that people can understand. It's a tool in a toolbox so to speak,
Yes.
that can be used in many different forms of therapies.
I'm going to hang on to your right brain, left brain running parallel. That was excellent. I like that.
Thank you. That was
Yeah.
just the mental picture that I had when you were describing it to me, which was helpful because I was reflecting on my own journey when you were describing that. So it was helpful for me to understand where I was and where I am now. And I'm 3 years down the road. So it certainly has taken a while for me. And I feel like you touched on it in the very beginning, on the expectations that we have on ourselves. I just can't say it enough that we don't allow ourselves to be in a place of grief very long in this society that we live in. I don't know if it's because it's not socially acceptable, or is it because people are uncomfortable around people that are grieving, because I'm not sure why. I don't know if it's because we have a compulsion that we want to fix everything and you can't fix it.
That's part of it. I think the other thing too, in our day and time of social media and being able to talk to each other quickly and getting things done instantly, you might say that we have more of a need for instant gratification than we ever have. And so we're definitely uncomfortable with another person's feelings, because when I'm in the mode of instant gratification, I'm not feeling my own feelings, except maybe anger and frustration that things aren't going my way. A lot of people have a lot of delayed processing in their lives because of instant gratification and wanting everything now, sadly.
Well, and look how long it took you to get to the place where you could work through your grief. And so that you just stuff it.
Yeah, I did. I stuffed it and I drank it and I did a lot of other things too. So yeah, it was staying pretty much down there until I hit my bottom. And I did hit my bottom. I came pretty close to not living in this world anymore at my own hand. God intervened.
And then you use those experiences to then help other people walk this road. And if anybody has a takeaway from our time here together tonight, I hope they hear that we're saying, don't walk this road alone.
No, yeah, don't do it. It's not, there is no loner in this one. It's not a one-man show. Yeah.
And you touched on something earlier. You said sometimes people see it as weakness. And I think maybe I may be wrong, but my interpretation is that is more sometimes from a male perspective.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Than a female perspective, because for me, I was so desperate. I needed help and I knew it and I wasn't ashamed to get it. But I guess I know my husband has shared his perspective on grief. When you are in that role as a father, as a husband, you are the provider. You are the one that's supposed to carry the load. You are the one that's supposed to protect. You're the one that's supposed to make things better. And then when you have a situation where you are thrust into events that you cannot control, then all of a sudden that's all gone and you can't do it. So as a man, you feel completely helpless.
And you could feel like a failure.
And that's exactly where Tony was, my husband. And he got to the point to where I just told him, I can't handle your grief and my grief. You have to get help. And he will tell you that it's the best decision he ever made.
I'm so glad he did.
I want people to hear that on the other side of this. It's scary because it's unknown and it's a lot of work and it could be frustrating and exhausting, but it's worth it.
Yes, it is. It is. It's true freedom. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paul. I enjoyed our time together so much. Thank you for being here. I'll include in the show notes information we can share with people that might want to get on your waiting list. Until next time, guys, take care. Thank you for listening to the Grief Mentors podcast with Teresa Davis. Subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to share this episode with someone in your sphere of influence that needs it today.